The words hit Miranda like a physical blow, even though she'd been expecting something cruel to come out of Vanessa's perfectly glossed lips. "Oh, don't mind her," Vanessa had said to the cluster of women at the charity gala, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she gestured dismissively toward Miranda. "She's just the first wife. Ancient history, really." The laughter that followed was polite but cutting, the kind that wealthy women use to establish social hierarchies at events like these. Miranda stood frozen for a moment, champagne flute trembling slightly in her manicured hand, watching her ex-husband Richard's new wife hold court among the city's elite. Vanessa was everything Miranda had once been in this world: young, beautiful, perfectly dressed, and utterly confident in her position as Mrs. Richard Blackwell. The only difference was that Miranda had built this world, and Vanessa had simply stepped into it when Richard decided he needed a newer model. Just the first wife. The phrase echoed in Miranda's mind as she excused herself from the gala, walking through the museum's marble halls with her head held high despite the humiliation burning in her chest. She'd founded this charity 15 years ago, had personally raised millions for children's literacy programs, had poured her heart and soul into making this annual gala the most important social event of the year. But now she was just an awkward reminder of Richard's past, someone to be dismissed and diminished by the woman who had replaced her. The divorce had been finalized 6 months ago, after 2 years of bitter legal battles that had left Miranda emotionally drained and financially devastated. Or so everyone thought. Richard had been clever about hiding assets, using his position as a prominent real estate developer to shuffle properties and investments through shell companies and overseas accounts. Miranda's lawyers had recovered what they could, but Richard had walked away with the majority of their shared wealth, including the penthouse apartment where he now lived with Vanessa. What Richard didn't know, what nobody knew except Miranda's most trusted advisors, was that she had been playing a much longer game. Years before their marriage had begun to crumble, Miranda had started making her own investments under her maiden name, building a portfolio that existed entirely outside of their joint assets. She'd been careful, methodical, and patient, learning from her late father's example of how to build wealth that couldn't be touched by vindictive spouses or greedy lawyers. The morning after the gala, Miranda sat in her new apartment, smaller than the penthouse but perfectly elegant, drinking coffee and reading the financial reports that her investment manager had delivered. Her real estate holdings alone were worth more than Richard suspected she had to her name, and that didn't include her stock portfolio, business investments, or the trust fund she'd inherited from her grandmother that had been growing untouched for decades. But it was the report on a particular property that made Miranda smile for the first time since the divorce papers had been signed. The Meridian Tower, a luxury high-rise in the most exclusive part of the city, had been quietly acquired through a series of shell companies that ultimately traced back to Miranda's private investment firm. The building housed some of the city's wealthiest residents, including, in the penthouse suite that Richard had insisted on keeping in the divorce, her ex-husband and his new wife. Miranda had been planning this moment for months, waiting for the right opportunity to reveal her hand. Vanessa's public humiliation at the charity gala had provided the perfect catalyst. It was time for the first wife to introduce herself as something much more important, their landlord. The letter was delivered on elegant stationery, the kind that suggested serious legal business without being overtly threatening. It was addressed to both Richard and Vanessa Blackwell, residents of Penthouse A at the Meridian Tower, and it arrived on a Tuesday morning when Miranda knew they would both be home. She'd timed it perfectly, having learned their routines through careful observation and the building's security reports that she now had access to as the owner. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Blackwell," the letter began in Miranda's careful script, "I am writing to introduce myself as the new owner of the Meridian Tower. As you may be aware, the building recently changed hands, and I wanted to personally reach out to our most valued residents to ensure a smooth transition. I look forward to maintaining the excellent landlord-tenant relationship that has made the Meridian Tower such a desirable address. Please don't hesitate to contact me if you have any questions or concerns. Sincerely, Miranda Blackwell Ashford, owner and managing director, Ashford Properties." She'd hyphenated her name for the letter, combining her married name with her maiden name in a way that would make her identity unmistakably clear, while also establishing her professional credentials. The signature was elegant but businesslike, the kind that appeared on million-dollar contracts and board resolutions. Miranda imagined Richard's face when he opened the letter, pictured him reading it once, twice, 3 times, before the full implications sank in. She wondered if he would immediately call his lawyers, or if he would sit in stunned silence while Vanessa demanded to know what was wrong. Either way, the power dynamic in their relationship had just shifted dramatically, and they didn't even know the extent of it yet. The phone call came within an hour of the letter's delivery. Miranda was in her home office, reviewing architectural plans for a renovation project on another property, when her assistant buzzed through on the intercom. "Mrs. Ashford," came the professional voice. "I have Richard Blackwell on line 1. He says it's urgent." Miranda smiled and instructed her assistant to put the call through, then waited a few moments before answering to let Richard's anxiety build. "Miranda." Richard's voice was tight, with barely controlled anger. "What the hell is this game you're playing?" She could hear the rustle of paper through the phone and knew he was holding her letter. "You can't actually think you can get away with this. My lawyers will have this overturned before the end of the week." "Hello, Richard," Miranda replied calmly, leaning back in her leather chair. "I'm not sure what you mean by game. I'm simply introducing myself to my tenants in a professional capacity. The Meridian Tower is a significant investment, and I believe in maintaining personal relationships with residents." Her tone was perfectly pleasant, as if she were discussing the weather rather than destroying his sense of security. "Cut the act, Miranda. You can't afford to buy that building. The divorce settlement didn't leave you with that kind of money. And we both know it." Richard's voice had shifted from anger to confusion, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Miranda had been counting on this reaction. His inability to believe that she could have resources he hadn't known about or controlled. "Oh, but I didn't buy it with the divorce settlement," Miranda said, allowing a note of amusement to creep into her voice. "I've owned the building for several months now. The purchase was completed well before our divorce was finalized. Quite a coincidence that you happen to be living in one of my properties, don't you think?" The silence on the other end of the line was so complete that Miranda wondered if the call had been dropped. When Richard spoke again, his voice was different, smaller, uncertain in a way she'd never heard before. "That's impossible. You don't have that kind of money. Your financial disclosures during the divorce showed everything you had." Miranda laughed softly, the sound carrying years of satisfaction at having outmaneuvered the man who had thought he was so much cleverer than his wife. "Richard, darling," she said, using the endearment that had once been genuine but now carried a sharp edge, "surely you didn't think I would put all my assets in joint accounts where you could access them? I've been building my own portfolio for years. The divorce settlement was just my share of our joint assets, a fraction of what I actually have." The truth was even more satisfying to say out loud than it had been to plan in secret. Another long silence, then the sound of Richard's breathing, becoming more labored. Miranda could almost see him pacing in the penthouse, probably looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city skyline, while realizing that his entire world had just shifted beneath his feet. "What do you want?" he asked finally, his voice resigned. "Want?" Miranda repeated, pretending to consider the question. "I don't want anything, Richard. I'm simply a landlord managing my property. Your lease is current, your rent is paid on time, and you've been model tenants. Why would I want anything beyond a normal business relationship?" Her tone was innocent, but they both knew this was far from a normal business relationship. The conversation ended shortly after, with Richard hanging up without saying goodbye, a rudeness that Miranda noted but didn't comment on. She knew he would spend the rest of the day frantically calling lawyers and financial advisors, trying to understand how his ex-wife had managed to acquire the building he lived in without his knowledge. The investigation would only confirm what she'd already told him. She was now his landlord, and there was nothing he could do about it. Vanessa's reaction was even more dramatic than Richard's, though Miranda learned about it secondhand through the building's concierge, who had been instructed to report any unusual activity in the penthouse. Apparently, Mrs. Blackwell had been heard screaming at her husband for letting that woman get one over on us and demanding that they move out immediately. The screaming had been followed by the sound of something expensive being thrown against a wall. But moving wasn't as simple as Vanessa assumed. The penthouse lease had 2 years remaining, with a substantial early termination penalty that would cost them more than most people made in a year. More importantly, the Meridian Tower was the most prestigious address in the city, and leaving would be seen as a social defeat that would affect their standing in the community. Richard's business depended on his image of success and sophistication. Moving to a lesser building would raise questions about his financial stability that he couldn't afford to answer. Miranda waited a week before making her next move, allowing Richard and Vanessa to stew in their new reality while she planned her approach. She'd learned patience during their marriage, watching Richard manipulate situations to his advantage, while she appeared to be the supportive wife who didn't understand business. Now it was time to apply those lessons from the position of power. The building meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening, officially billed as an opportunity for the new owner to meet residents and discuss upcoming improvements to the property. Miranda had planned it carefully, knowing that the building's wealthy tenants would attend out of curiosity about their mysterious new landlord. The meeting would take place in the building's elegant community room, with wine and catered appetizers to create a social atmosphere. Miranda arrived early, dressed in a navy blue suit that was both professional and expensive, her hair styled in a way that projected authority without being severe. She greeted each resident personally as they arrived, introducing herself as Miranda Ashford and discussing their individual needs and concerns with the genuine interest of someone who cared about her investment. When Richard and Vanessa arrived, 20 minutes late and clearly reluctant to attend, the room was already full of their neighbors and fellow tenants. Miranda watched them pause in the doorway, scanning the room for her before realizing that the poised, confident woman holding court near the windows was indeed Richard's ancient history first wife. Vanessa looked stunning as always, but there was a tightness around her eyes that suggested she wasn't sleeping well. Richard appeared haggard in a way that was carefully concealed by expensive clothing and professional grooming, but Miranda knew him well enough to see the stress beneath the surface. They made their way into the room slowly, acknowledging other residents with forced smiles while avoiding eye contact with Miranda. "Mr. and Mrs. Blackwell," Miranda said warmly when they finally approached her, extending her hand as if meeting casual acquaintances. "How wonderful to see you both. I hope you received my letter and that the transition has been smooth for you." Her tone was perfectly professional, but loud enough for nearby residents to hear and understand that she was personally acquainted with the couple. Vanessa's smile was glacial as she shook Miranda's hand. "Mrs. Ashford, is it? What an interesting coincidence that you happened to purchase our building." Her emphasis on the word "our" was subtle but clear. She was claiming territory that she actually had no legal right to. "Not really a coincidence," Miranda replied pleasantly. "The Meridian Tower is an excellent investment property, and I've had my eye on it for some time. I'm particularly pleased to have such distinguished residents as yourselves." She gestured around the room at the other tenants, most of whom were listening to their conversation with barely concealed interest. The rest of the evening proceeded smoothly, with Miranda discussing building improvements, maintenance schedules, and her vision for maintaining the Meridian Tower's reputation as the city's premier residential address. She answered questions with the expertise of someone who understood both real estate investment and luxury property management, impressing the residents with her knowledge and professionalism. Richard and Vanessa left early, claiming a prior engagement, but not before Miranda overheard Vanessa hissing at her husband about that woman and demanding to know how they were going to handle this situation. Miranda made a mental note to have building security pay particular attention to any unusual activity in the penthouse. The next phase of Miranda's plan began 2 weeks later, when she announced a comprehensive renovation of the building's common areas and amenities. The work would include upgrading the fitness center, renovating the pool area, and installing new security systems throughout the building. All residents would need to provide updated emergency contact information and submit to new background checks as part of the enhanced security measures. For most residents, these changes were welcome improvements that would increase their property values and quality of life. For Richard and Vanessa, however, the renovations represented a series of inconveniences and invasions of privacy that would make their lives significantly more complicated. Construction noise during the day, restricted access to amenities they paid premium prices to use, and increased scrutiny from building management and security. Miranda had carefully planned the timing and scope of the renovations to maximize disruption while remaining within her rights as a property owner. The work would take 6 months to complete, with different areas of the building affected at different times. The penthouse, being on the top floor, would experience the most noise and inconvenience as workers accessed the roof and upper floors. The background checks were particularly brilliant, Miranda thought, because they would require Richard to disclose financial information that might reveal the extent of his hidden assets. As a high-profile businessman with complex financial arrangements, any discrepancies between his stated income and his lifestyle would be noticed and potentially investigated further. Vanessa's reaction to the renovations was predictably dramatic. She complained to building management about the noise, demanded schedule changes that would accommodate her social calendar, and generally made herself unpleasant to deal with. Miranda instructed her property management team to be unfailingly polite but inflexible about the renovation schedule and requirements. The breaking point came 3 months into the renovations, when Vanessa confronted Miranda directly in the building's lobby. It was a Tuesday morning, and Miranda was meeting with the contractor about some scheduling adjustments when Vanessa appeared, clearly having waited for an opportunity to catch her alone. "I know what you're doing," Vanessa said without preamble, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "This whole renovation is just your way of getting back at Richard. You're using your ownership of this building to harass us." Her voice was pitched low but intense, carrying the desperation of someone who felt trapped. Miranda looked up from her conversation with the contractor, her expression one of mild surprise. "Mrs. Blackwell, I'm not sure what you mean. The renovations are necessary improvements that will benefit all residents. If you're experiencing particular difficulties, I'd be happy to discuss them with you through proper channels." Her tone was professional and slightly puzzled, as if she genuinely couldn't understand Vanessa's accusations. "Don't play innocent with me," Vanessa snapped, abandoning any pretense of civility. "You bought this building specifically to make our lives miserable. You can't stand that Richard chose me over you, so you're using your money to punish us." Her accusations were loud enough to attract attention from other residents in the lobby, exactly the kind of public scene that Vanessa usually avoided. Miranda remained calm, speaking in the measured tone she'd perfected during years of dealing with Richard's tantrums. "Mrs. Blackwell, I understand that renovations can be disruptive, but they're a normal part of property ownership and maintenance. If you're unhappy with your living situation, you're certainly free to explore other housing options." The suggestion was delivered pleasantly, but everyone present understood it as the dismissal it was intended to be. Vanessa's face flushed with anger and embarrassment as she realized that several neighbors had witnessed her outburst. She turned and stalked toward the elevators without another word, leaving Miranda to continue her conversation with the contractor as if nothing had happened. But Miranda had seen the tears in Vanessa's eyes and knew that the pressure was finally getting to the woman who had once dismissed her as, quote, just the first wife. That evening, Miranda received a phone call from Richard, requesting a private meeting to discuss their, quote, business relationship. His tone was careful and formal, but she could hear the underlying desperation. He was finally ready to acknowledge that his ex-wife held all the cards and that he needed to negotiate from a position of weakness. They met at a neutral location, an upscale restaurant where they were unlikely to be overheard but where other diners would prevent any dramatic scenes. Richard arrived first and was waiting at a corner table when Miranda entered, looking like a man who had aged 5 years in the past few months. The stress of living under his ex-wife's control was clearly taking its toll. "Thank you for meeting me," Richard said as Miranda sat down, his politeness strained but genuine. "I think it's time we discuss this situation like adults." Miranda noted that he was no longer trying to deny her ownership of the building or question her motives. He had finally accepted the reality of their reversed positions. "Of course," Miranda replied graciously, settling into her chair and accepting the wine menu from their server. "I'm always willing to discuss business matters with my tenants." Her emphasis on the word tenants was subtle but unmistakable, a reminder of the new hierarchy in their relationship. Richard waited until they had ordered and were alone before speaking again. "What do you want, Miranda? What will it take for you to leave us alone?" His question was direct and defeated, the words of a man who had finally recognized that he had underestimated his opponent. Miranda sipped her wine and considered her response. She had been waiting for this moment for months, but now that it was here, she found that her feelings were more complex than she had expected. The anger and hurt that had driven her planning were still there, but they were mixed with something that might have been pity for the man who had once been her husband. "I don't want anything from you, Richard," she said finally. "I'm not trying to force you out of the building or make your life miserable. I'm simply managing my property in a professional manner." She paused, meeting his eyes across the table. "But I will not tolerate being disrespected or dismissed by you or your wife. If Vanessa has concerns about building policies or renovations, she can address them through proper channels like any other tenant." "She's sorry about what she said at the charity gala," Richard offered, though his tone suggested that any apology had been extracted rather than freely given. "She was nervous about meeting your friends, and she misspoke." His attempt to excuse Vanessa's behavior was half-hearted, as if he knew how inadequate it sounded. Miranda smiled slightly, the expression carrying no warmth. "I'm sure she is sorry. Sorry that her words had consequences she didn't anticipate. But apologizing for being caught doesn't change the intent behind the action." She leaned forward slightly, her voice remaining conversational but taking on a harder edge. "Vanessa called me just the first wife and treated me like an embarrassing relic from your past. Now I'm her landlord, and that relationship comes with certain realities that she'll need to accept." Richard was quiet for a long moment, staring at his untouched dinner. When he looked up, there was something in his expression that Miranda had never seen before. Genuine remorse mixed with what might have been respect. "I handled our divorce badly," he said quietly. "I was cruel and greedy, and I treated you like you didn't matter. I thought I could take everything and leave you with nothing because you wouldn't know how to fight back." "You were wrong," Miranda said simply, and the understatement hung in the air between them. They both knew that Richard had lost far more than money in their divorce. He had lost any claim to moral superiority and had revealed himself to be smaller and more petty than anyone had realized. "Yes, I was wrong," Richard acknowledged. "About a lot of things. About you, about what you were capable of, about what really mattered." He took a sip of wine and seemed to gather himself before continuing. "What happens now? Do we spend the next 2 years making each other miserable, or can we find a way to coexist?" Miranda considered his question while studying the man across from her. The Richard she had married would never have admitted to being wrong or asked for guidance from a woman he had dismissed. Perhaps losing everything he thought he could control had taught him something about humility and respect. "That depends entirely on you and Vanessa," Miranda replied. "If you can treat me as what I am, a professional property owner conducting legitimate business, then we can have a normal landlord-tenant relationship. But if you continue to act as if I'm some vindictive ex-wife, trying to make your life difficult, then every interaction will be unpleasant for everyone involved." Richard nodded slowly, understanding the terms being offered. "And the renovations? The background checks? The building policies?" His questions were cautious, testing whether there was room for negotiation, or if he simply had to accept whatever decisions she made. "The renovations are necessary improvements that will increase property values for all residents," Miranda said, her tone becoming more businesslike. "The background checks are standard security measures for a building of this caliber. The building policies are designed to maintain the quality of life that residents expect when they pay premium rents." She paused, then added, "Everything I'm doing would be done by any responsible property owner. The only difference is that you know me personally." The conversation continued for another hour, with Richard asking careful questions about building management and Miranda providing professional answers that established clear boundaries. By the time they parted ways, both understood that their relationship had been permanently redefined. Richard was no longer the powerful husband who could dismiss and diminish his wife. He was a tenant who needed to maintain a respectful relationship with his landlord. Over the following months, the dynamic in the building shifted noticeably. Vanessa stopped making unreasonable demands and complaints, though she continued to avoid any direct interaction with Miranda. Richard became a model tenant, following all building policies and paying his rent early each month. The renovations proceeded on schedule with minimal complaints from the penthouse. Miranda found that her victory felt different than she had expected. The satisfaction of having outmaneuvered Richard was real, but it was tempered by the recognition that revenge, no matter how justified, couldn't undo the hurt and betrayal she had experienced. What mattered more was that she had reclaimed her power and self-respect, proving to herself and everyone else that she was far more than just the first wife. The charity gala the following year provided a perfect opportunity to demonstrate how completely the tables had turned. Miranda arrived fashionably dressed and immediately began circulating among the guests, many of whom were also her tenants or had heard about her real estate empire through the city's interconnected social networks. When someone asked about her involvement with the literacy charity, Miranda smiled and explained that she had founded the organization 15 years earlier and remained deeply committed to its mission. "Education is the foundation of opportunity," she said, "and I've been fortunate enough to have the resources to support that belief through both charitable giving and business investments." Richard and Vanessa arrived later in the evening, and Miranda watched them navigate the social landscape with noticeably less confidence than they had displayed the previous year. Word had spread about Miranda's financial success and her ownership of prime real estate properties, transforming her from a discarded first wife into a formidable businesswoman who commanded respect. When their paths crossed near the silent auction tables, Vanessa actually nodded politely and said, "Good evening, Mrs. Ashford." The greeting was stilted and clearly reluctant, but it represented a dramatic change from the dismissive contempt she had shown the year before. "Mrs. Blackwell," Miranda replied graciously, "how lovely to see you. I hope you're enjoying the renovations at the Meridian Tower. The new fitness center should be completed next month." Her tone was friendly but professional, treating Vanessa exactly like any other tenant with whom she might discuss building improvements. As the evening progressed, Miranda found herself surrounded by admirers and potential business partners who were interested in her investment strategies and real estate expertise. She had become exactly what she had always been capable of being, a successful, independent woman who commanded respect through her accomplishments rather than her relationship to a man. Standing in the same museum where she had been humiliated a year earlier, now surrounded by people who recognized her worth and sought her advice, Miranda reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had called her just the first wife was across the room, carefully monitoring her words and behavior to avoid offending the landlord who controlled her living situation. But Miranda no longer needed Vanessa's acknowledgement or Richard's respect to feel complete. She had built something entirely her own, created success that no one could take away or diminish. The title of first wife had been replaced by far more meaningful descriptions: successful businesswoman, property owner, philanthropist, and independent woman. As the gala ended and guests began to leave, Miranda made her way toward the exit, with the satisfaction of someone who had not only survived betrayal, but had transformed it into triumph. Tomorrow she would return to managing her properties, expanding her business interests, and building the life she wanted rather than the one someone else had planned for her. The elevator at the Meridian Tower carried her to her new apartment. Not the penthouse, but a beautifully renovated unit that was entirely hers. As she looked out at the city lights through her windows, Miranda smiled at the thought that somewhere above her, Richard and Vanessa were probably having another argument about their impossible situation. She was no longer just the first wife. She was the landlord, the business owner, the woman who had taken control of her own destiny. And that was infinitely more satisfying than any revenge could ever be. 6 months after the charity gala, Miranda's transformation from discarded first wife to formidable businesswoman had become the talk of the city's social circles. Her real estate empire had expanded beyond the Meridian Tower to include 3 other luxury properties, a boutique hotel downtown, and several commercial buildings that housed some of the city's most prestigious law firms and financial institutions. What made Miranda's success particularly noteworthy wasn't just the scale of her achievements, but the quiet, methodical way she had built her empire, while everyone assumed she was just another wealthy divorcee nursing her wounds. She had attended industry conferences, networked with developers and investors, and studied market trends, while her former social circle gossiped about her divorce settlement and speculated about her future prospects. The morning that changed everything started like any other, with Miranda reviewing property reports over coffee in her home office. Her assistant knocked and entered with an expression that suggested important news. "Mrs. Ashford," she said, placing a folder on Miranda's desk. "We've received an interesting proposal. Blackwell Development wants to purchase the Meridian Tower." Miranda's coffee cup paused halfway to her lips as she processed this information. Richard's company was offering to buy the building where he lived, presumably in an attempt to regain some control over his living situation and remove his ex-wife from a position of power over him. The irony was so perfect that Miranda almost laughed out loud. She opened the folder and reviewed the purchase offer, noting that it was for significantly more than she had paid for the building. Richard was apparently desperate enough to overpay substantially for the privilege of becoming his own landlord again. The offer letter was written in the formal language of corporate acquisitions, but Miranda could read the desperation between the lines. "Schedule a meeting with Mr. Blackwell," Miranda instructed her assistant. "Tell him I'm willing to discuss his proposal, but only if he comes alone. This is a business matter that doesn't require legal representation or corporate intermediaries." She wanted to look Richard in the eye when she delivered her response to his attempt to buy his way out of their uncomfortable relationship. The meeting took place in Miranda's office, a space that reflected her new status with expensive furniture, original artwork, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered commanding views of the city. Richard arrived precisely on time, dressed in his best suit, and carrying himself with the artificial confidence of a man trying to project power he didn't actually possess. "Thank you for seeing me," Richard began, settling into the chair across from Miranda's desk. "I assume you've reviewed our offer for the Meridian Tower. I think you'll agree it's more than generous." His tone was carefully neutral, but Miranda could see the tension in his shoulders and the slight tremor in his hands as he placed his briefcase on the floor. "It is indeed a generous offer," Miranda agreed, leaning back in her chair and studying her ex-husband's face. "Almost suspiciously generous, actually. One might wonder why Blackwell Development would be willing to pay so much over market value for a single residential building." She let the question hang in the air, watching Richard struggle to maintain his composure. "The Meridian Tower is a prime property in an excellent location," Richard replied, reciting what sounded like a rehearsed explanation. "We believe it represents a solid long-term investment that fits well with our portfolio strategy." His words were professional, but his eyes were pleading with her to just take the money and end their uncomfortable arrangement. Miranda smiled slightly, the expression carrying no warmth. "Richard, we both know this isn't about investment strategy. You want to buy the building because you can't stand living under your ex-wife's authority. You're willing to overpay by millions of dollars just to avoid the daily reminder that I outsmarted you." Her directness caused Richard to flinch, but he didn't deny her assessment. "Can you blame me?" Richard asked, finally dropping his professional facade. "Do you have any idea what it's like to live knowing that every decision about my home goes through you? Vanessa barely sleeps anymore, and she jumps every time the phone rings because she thinks it's going to be another building notice or policy change." His admission of weakness was more honest than anything he'd said to her in years. "I can imagine it's uncomfortable," Miranda replied without sympathy. "Almost as uncomfortable as discovering that your husband has been hiding assets and planning to leave you with nothing after 15 years of marriage. Almost as humiliating as being dismissed as just the first wife at a public event by the woman who replaced you." Her voice remained calm, but the words carried the weight of all the pain and anger she had endured. Richard had the grace to look ashamed, his eyes dropping to his hands as he absorbed her words. "I know I hurt you badly," he said quietly. "I know the divorce was ugly and unfair, and I know Vanessa's behavior has been inexcusable. But we can't change the past, Miranda. We can only decide what happens next." "You're absolutely right," Miranda agreed, standing up and walking to the window that overlooked the city skyline. "We can't change the past, but we can learn from it. The past taught me that I was much stronger and more capable than anyone gave me credit for, including myself. It taught me that I didn't need a husband's permission or approval to build wealth and success." She turned back to face Richard, her expression resolute. "And it taught me that some things shouldn't be forgiven just because time has passed." Richard's face fell as he realized that his offer was going to be rejected. "So you won't sell? You're going to keep us trapped in this situation indefinitely?" His question carried a note of desperation that would have been unthinkable from him during their marriage, when he had held all the power and made all the decisions. "I'm not keeping you trapped anywhere," Miranda corrected him firmly. "You're free to move out of the Meridian Tower anytime you choose. You're free to break your lease and pay the early termination penalty. You're free to find another luxury building that meets your standards. What you're not free to do is force me to sell my property just because owning it makes you uncomfortable." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Richard alternately pleading and trying to negotiate, but Miranda's position remained unchanged. She would not sell the Meridian Tower to Blackwell Development at any price. The building represented more than just a real estate investment. It was a symbol of her independence and a reminder that she had rebuilt her life on her own terms. After Richard left, looking defeated and smaller than she had ever seen him, Miranda called her investment advisor to discuss expanding her real estate portfolio even further. If Richard thought one building gave her too much power over his life, he was going to be very unhappy when he learned about her next acquisition. The Blackwell Development headquarters occupied 3 floors of a prestigious downtown office building that Richard had always been proud to call home for his company. The building represented success and stability in the business community, with marble lobbies, high-end restaurants, and the kind of address that impressed clients and competitors alike. Miranda had been quietly researching the building's ownership structure for months, learning that it was owned by an investment group that was looking to sell as part of a portfolio restructuring. The price was substantial, but well within her means, and the acquisition would give her control over not just Richard's residence, but his business headquarters as well. The purchase negotiations took 6 weeks to complete, during which Miranda was careful to keep her identity as the buyer confidential through layers of shell companies and legal representatives. She wanted the sale to be finalized before Richard learned that his ex-wife was about to become his commercial landlord as well as his residential one. The closing took place on a Friday afternoon, with Miranda signing the final papers in her lawyer's office while Richard was presumably at work just a few miles away, unaware that his business world was about to be turned upside down once again. By 5 o'clock, Miranda owned the building that housed Blackwell Development, along with the 47 other businesses that leased space there. She waited until the following Monday to send the introduction letter, timing it to arrive just as Richard would be settling into his office for what he thought would be a normal week. The letter was similar to the one she had sent about the Meridian Tower, professionally written but unmistakably clear about the new ownership structure. The phone call came within minutes of the letter's delivery. Miranda was reviewing quarterly reports when her assistant announced that Richard was on the line, and she could hear the barely controlled panic in his voice before he even spoke. "Miranda, please tell me this is some kind of mistake. Please tell me you didn't actually buy our building." "Good morning, Richard," Miranda replied pleasantly. "I trust you received my letter about the ownership transition. I wanted to personally assure you that Blackwell Development's lease terms will remain unchanged, and that I'm committed to maintaining the building's reputation as a premier business address." Her tone was professional and reassuring, as if she were speaking to any other tenant rather than her ex-husband. "This is insane," Richard said, his voice rising despite his obvious efforts to remain calm. "You can't seriously expect me to run my business as your tenant. Do you have any idea how this looks to my clients and competitors? How am I supposed to project authority and success when everyone knows my landlord is my ex-wife?" Miranda considered his question with the same detached interest she might apply to any business problem. "I suppose you'll need to find a way to separate your personal feelings from your professional responsibilities," she said finally. "Many successful business people work in buildings they don't own. I'm sure you'll adapt." The conversation devolved from there, with Richard alternating between pleading and threats, while Miranda remained calm and professional. She pointed out that his lease had 18 months remaining, and that breaking it would cost his company more than it could afford, especially given the financial pressures that had motivated his attempt to buy the Meridian Tower in the first place. By the time the call ended, Richard understood that his options were limited to accepting his new reality or facing bankruptcy-level financial losses. His ex-wife had effectively cornered him in both his personal and professional life, and there was no escape route that didn't involve enormous sacrifice. Vanessa's reaction to the news was reportedly even more dramatic than Richard's, according to the building superintendent, who discreetly shared gossip with Miranda's property manager. Neighbors had heard shouting, crying, and the sound of objects being thrown, followed by Vanessa storming out of the penthouse with several suitcases and not returning for 3 days. When Vanessa did return, she was different. Gone was the haughty confidence and casual cruelty that had characterized her interactions with Miranda and others she considered beneath her social status. In its place was a brittle politeness and obvious anxiety that suggested she was finally beginning to understand the extent of her powerlessness in this situation. The change became apparent during their next encounter in the building's lobby, when Vanessa actually approached Miranda instead of avoiding her. "Mrs. Ashford," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "I was wondering if we could have a brief conversation about our living situation." Miranda looked up from her phone, where she had been reviewing renovation plans for the building's ground floor retail space. "Of course, Mrs. Blackwell. What can I help you with?" Her tone was politely curious, giving no indication of whether she was pleased or annoyed by the interruption. Vanessa glanced around the lobby nervously before speaking, as if checking for witnesses to her humiliation. "I wanted to apologize for my behavior over the past year," she said, the words clearly difficult for her to say. "I was rude and disrespectful, and I understand now that my actions have had consequences I didn't anticipate." "I appreciate your apology," Miranda replied neutrally, offering no absolution or reassurance. She waited for Vanessa to continue, maintaining the kind of professional distance that made it clear this conversation was between a property owner and a tenant, not between two women seeking understanding. "I'm hoping we can find a way to coexist peacefully," Vanessa continued, her desperation becoming more apparent with each word. "Richard's business is suffering because of the stress, and I know that's affecting our ability to meet our financial obligations. If there's anything I can do to improve our relationship, I'm willing to listen." Miranda studied Vanessa's face, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. The woman who had once dismissed her as, quote, "just the first wife," was now begging for mercy from the landlord, who controlled every aspect of her daily life. "Mrs. Blackwell," Miranda said finally, "I think you may be misunderstanding the nature of our relationship. I'm not your enemy, and I'm not trying to punish you or your husband. I'm simply a property owner conducting business in a professional manner. If you follow the lease terms and building policies, treat staff and other residents with respect, and pay your rent on time, we won't have any problems." Vanessa nodded eagerly, clearly relieved by what sounded like a reasonable set of expectations. "Of course, absolutely. We want to be good tenants. We appreciate everything you've done to improve the building, and we understand that renovations and policy changes are necessary for maintaining property values." "I'm glad to hear that," Miranda replied, then paused as if considering whether to say more. "Mrs. Blackwell, I want you to understand something. My success in business has nothing to do with my feelings about you or Richard. I've built my company and acquired these properties because I'm good at identifying opportunities and executing long-term strategies. The fact that you happen to live and work in buildings I own is simply a coincidence." The lie was delivered with such conviction that Vanessa almost seemed to believe it, nodding as if Miranda's explanation made perfect sense. "I understand," Vanessa said, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "Thank you for being so professional about everything." As Vanessa hurried toward the elevators, Miranda reflected on how completely their positions had reversed. The woman who had once held social power through her marriage to a successful man was now reduced to pleading with the woman she had tried to diminish and dismiss. But Miranda found that the victory felt hollow in a way she hadn't expected. The truth was that owning the buildings where Richard and Vanessa lived and worked had given Miranda exactly what she had wanted, proof that she was more powerful and successful than they had ever imagined. But it had also trapped her in an ongoing relationship with people she would rather forget, forcing her to be reminded daily of the pain and betrayal that had motivated her quest for revenge. Over the following months, Miranda began to question whether her elaborate scheme had been worth the emotional energy it required. Managing properties where her ex-husband and his wife were tenants meant that every business decision was scrutinized for personal motives, every policy change was interpreted as potential harassment, and every interaction carried the weight of their shared history. The breaking point came when Miranda received a call from her property manager about a maintenance emergency in the Meridian Tower. A pipe had burst in the wall between the penthouse and the unit below, causing significant water damage that would require extensive repairs and temporary relocation of affected residents. The irony was perfect and terrible. Miranda now had to arrange temporary housing for Richard and Vanessa while their home was being repaired, essentially forcing them to depend on her generosity and resources during a crisis. The situation would have been complicated enough with ordinary tenants, but with her ex-husband and his wife, every decision carried potential for misunderstanding and conflict. Miranda spent the weekend considering her options, weighing her desire to maintain professional standards against her exhaustion with the ongoing drama. By Monday morning, she had made a decision that surprised even her closest advisors. She was going to sell both buildings and finally, truly, move on with her life. The decision wasn't about forgiveness or reconciliation. It was about recognizing that some victories came at too high a price, and that real success meant building a future rather than dwelling on the past. Miranda had proven everything she needed to prove about her capabilities and worth. Now it was time to invest her energy in opportunities that excited rather than exhausted her. She called Richard first, offering to sell him both buildings at fair market value. Not the inflated prices he had previously offered, but reasonable prices that would allow him to regain control over his living and working spaces without bankrupting his company. The conversation was brief and businesslike, with both of them understanding that this was an ending rather than a new beginning. "Why now?" Richard asked as they concluded their discussion. "You have us exactly where you wanted us. Why let us go?" His question was genuinely curious, rather than suspicious, as if he had finally learned to accept that Miranda's motivations might be more complex than simple revenge. "Because I have better things to do with my time and money," Miranda replied honestly. "I've built something I'm proud of, and I want to focus on growing it rather than managing the past." She paused, then added, "Besides, I think we've all learned what we needed to learn from this situation." The property sales were completed within 2 months, with Miranda using the proceeds to purchase a portfolio of commercial properties in another city where she could build her business without the complicated emotional baggage of her old life. She kept her apartment in the Meridian Tower until her lease expired, but she began spending more time in her new city, developing relationships and opportunities that had nothing to do with her past. On her last day as Richard and Vanessa's landlord, Miranda walked through the Meridian Tower one final time, saying goodbye to the building that had been the symbol of her transformation from abandoned wife to successful businesswoman. The penthouse where her ex-husband lived was just another luxury apartment now, stripped of its power to hurt or anger her. Standing in the lobby where Vanessa had once confronted her about the renovations, Miranda realized that she felt lighter than she had in years. The weight of carrying anger and planning revenge had been more exhausting than she had realized, and letting it go felt like setting down a burden she had carried for too long. 6 months later, Miranda was featured on the cover of a national business magazine as one of the country's most successful female real estate developers. The article focused on her innovative approaches to mixed-use development and her plans for creating affordable housing integrated with luxury properties. There was no mention of her divorce or her previous life as Richard Blackwell's wife. The woman who had once been dismissed as just the first wife had become something far more important. A successful entrepreneur who had built her own empire and was using her wealth and influence to make a positive impact on her community. She was no longer defined by her relationship to any man, but by her own achievements and vision for the future. And in the end, that was a far better revenge than anything she could have planned. 2 years after selling the buildings and moving to Portland, Miranda received an unexpected phone call that would test just how completely she had moved beyond her past. Her assistant announced that Vanessa Blackwell was on the line, calling from what sounded like a hospital room based on the background noise. "Miranda?" Vanessa's voice was different. Smaller, more fragile than Miranda had ever heard it. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I didn't know who else to call. Richard had a heart attack 3 days ago. He's in a coma, and the doctors aren't sure if he's going to make it." Miranda felt an unexpected jolt of concern, followed immediately by confusion about why Vanessa was calling her with this information. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said carefully. "That must be very frightening for you, but I'm not sure why you're calling me about Richard's condition." There was a long pause before Vanessa spoke again, and when she did, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because you're the only person who really knew him. You were married to him for 15 years, and despite everything that happened between us, you understood him in ways that I never did. I've been sitting here for 3 days, and I realized I don't know how to advocate for him or make the decisions he would want me to make. The admission was so raw and honest that Miranda found herself genuinely moved by Vanessa's vulnerability. The woman who had once been so confident in her position as the new wife was now facing the possibility of becoming a widow and realizing how little she actually knew about the man she had married. "Vanessa," Miranda said gently, "I appreciate that you're scared and looking for support, but Richard's medical decisions should be made by his family and his doctors. You're his wife. You have both the legal authority and the emotional connection to make those choices." "But I don't," Vanessa said, her voice breaking slightly. "We've been married for 3 years, but most of that time was spent dealing with the aftermath of your divorce and the stress of living under your oversight. We never had time to just be a normal couple. I don't know his wishes about medical care. I don't know who his closest friends are. I don't even know if he has a living will." Miranda closed her eyes, remembering the conversations she and Richard had shared during their marriage about end-of-life care, family medical history, and the kinds of decisions that couples discussed when they planned to grow old together. Vanessa was right. She probably did know Richard's wishes better than his current wife did. "Has his family been contacted?" Miranda asked, shifting into the practical problem-solving mode that had served her well in business. "His brother David lives in Chicago, and his parents are in Florida. They should be involved in any major medical decisions." "His brother is flying in tonight," Vanessa replied. "But his parents are both in poor health themselves, and the stress of traveling would be dangerous for them. David asked me to coordinate with the doctors and keep the family informed, but I feel so unprepared for this responsibility." Miranda found herself in an impossible position. She had worked hard to move beyond her anger toward Richard and Vanessa, but she had never imagined being drawn back into their lives during a medical crisis. Every instinct told her to express sympathy and then politely disconnect from the situation. But another part of her, the part that had once loved Richard enough to marry him, felt compelled to offer help. "Would it be helpful if I spoke with David?" Miranda offered carefully. Not to interfere with medical decisions, but to share information about Richard's health history and preferences that might be relevant for his care. The offer was reasonable and appropriate, but it also represented a step back into the complicated web of relationships she had worked so hard to escape. "Would you?" Vanessa asked, relief evident in her voice. "I know I have no right to ask for your help after everything that's happened, but I'm in over my head here. Richard always handled everything: finances, medical appointments, family communication. I don't even know who his insurance carrier is or where he keeps his important documents." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Miranda providing practical guidance about medical advocacy and offering to contact David Blackwell to share relevant information about Richard's health history. She found herself genuinely concerned about Richard's condition and sympathetic to Vanessa's obvious distress, despite their complicated history. After ending the call, Miranda sat in her Portland office looking out at the mountains and wondering how she had become the person that Vanessa turned to in a crisis. The irony wasn't lost on her that the woman who had once dismissed her as insignificant was now seeking her guidance and support during the most difficult moment of her life. The conversation with David Blackwell was easier than Miranda had expected. Richard's brother remembered her fondly from their marriage and was grateful for any information that might help with medical decisions. Miranda shared details about Richard's family medical history, his previous conversations about life support and quality of life issues, and the names of doctors who had treated him during their marriage. "I appreciate you taking the time to help," David said as their conversation wound down. "I know the divorce was difficult for everyone involved, but Richard always spoke well of you. I think he regretted how things ended between you two." The comment surprised Miranda, who had assumed that Richard painted her as the vindictive ex-wife in conversations with his family. Over the following week, Miranda found herself checking in regularly with David about Richard's condition and offering support to Vanessa through text messages and brief phone calls. She told herself that her involvement was purely humanitarian. Helping someone navigate a medical crisis was simply the right thing to do, regardless of their personal history. But if Miranda was being honest with herself, she also felt a sense of closure in being able to respond to Richard's medical emergency with grace and generosity rather than petty satisfaction. The woman she had become through building her own success was capable of compassion, even toward people who had hurt her, and that felt like a kind of victory that was more meaningful than any business achievement. Richard regained consciousness after 10 days in a coma, though his recovery would be slow and uncertain. The heart attack had been severe enough to require surgery and extensive rehabilitation, and his doctors warned that his ability to return to his previous level of activity was questionable. Miranda flew back to her former city when David asked if she would visit Richard in the hospital. "He's been asking about you," David explained. "I think he wants to apologize for some things, and the doctors say that resolving emotional stress could be important for his recovery." Miranda agreed to the visit, though she wasn't sure what she hoped to accomplish or how she would feel seeing Richard in such a vulnerable state. The man in the hospital bed looked years older than the Richard she remembered, with gray skin and medical equipment that emphasized his fragility. But his eyes were alert and focused when she entered his room, and he tried to sit up straighter when he saw her. "Miranda," he said, his voice hoarse from the breathing tube that had recently been removed. "Thank you for coming. David told me you've been helping Vanessa navigate all of this. I know you didn't have to do that." His gratitude was genuine and humble in a way that reminded Miranda of the man she had originally fallen in love with, before success and ego had changed him. "I'm glad you're going to be okay," Miranda replied, settling into the chair beside his bed. "You gave everyone quite a scare." She studied his face, noting the vulnerability that illness had stripped away all his usual defenses and pretenses. "I've had a lot of time to think while I've been lying here," Richard said, his words coming slowly as he gathered his strength. "About my life, about the choices I've made, about the people I've hurt. I owe you an apology that's about 15 years overdue." He paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "I was a terrible husband to you, Miranda. I was selfish and cruel, and I treated you like you didn't matter. You deserved so much better than what I gave you." Miranda felt tears prick her eyes, though she wasn't sure if they were for the man Richard had been, the man he was now, or the years they had both lost to anger and resentment. "We both made mistakes," she said gently. "We were young and didn't know how to handle success or communicate about what we really needed from each other." "No," Richard said firmly, showing more energy than he had since she'd arrived. "Don't make excuses for me. I knew what I was doing when I hid money from you, when I planned to leave you with nothing, when I let Vanessa treat you badly. I made those choices because I thought I could get away with it, not because I didn't know better." His honesty was brutal and complete, leaving no room for the comfortable lies that people sometimes told themselves about their past behavior. They talked for nearly an hour, with Richard sharing reflections about their marriage and his regrets about how it had ended. Miranda found herself remembering good times they had shared and feeling genuine sadness for the relationship that had been lost to pride and poor choices. "I want you to know," Richard said as their visit was ending, "that watching you build your business and seeing how successful you've become has been the one bright spot in this whole mess. I'm proud of what you've accomplished, even though I have no right to take any credit for it." His words carried a sincerity that made Miranda believe he had genuinely changed during his medical crisis. "Thank you," Miranda replied, meaning it. "That means more to me than you might realize." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Richard, I forgive you, not because you've asked for it or because you deserve it, but because carrying anger was exhausting, and letting it go has made room for better things in my life." The flight back to Portland gave Miranda time to process the complex emotions that the hospital visit had stirred up. She felt closure in a way she hadn't expected, but also a renewed appreciation for the life she had built independently. Seeing Richard so diminished had reminded her of how far she had traveled from the woman who had once defined herself through her marriage to him. 3 months later, Miranda received a wedding invitation that initially confused her. Vanessa Blackwell was marrying someone named Michael Chen, a cardiologist she had met during Richard's hospitalization. The invitation was accompanied by a handwritten note that explained the situation and asked for Miranda's understanding. "Richard and I realized during his recovery that we had never really been right for each other," Vanessa wrote in careful script. "We were both trying to prove something that wasn't true, and his medical crisis helped us see that we wanted different things from life. Our divorce was finalized last month, and we're both happier than we've been in years. I wanted you to know because you were kind to me during the worst time of my life, and your example of rebuilding after divorce gave me courage to make my own changes." Miranda studied the invitation and note, marveling at how completely everyone's lives had been transformed by the events that had begun with her humiliation at a charity gala. Richard's heart attack had apparently given him and Vanessa the clarity to end their marriage honestly, rather than continuing to struggle in a relationship that didn't serve either of them. A year later, Miranda opened her morning newspaper to find Richard's obituary in the business section. He had died peacefully in his sleep, 18 months after his heart attack, having spent his final year reconciling with family members and making amends for past mistakes. The obituary mentioned his successful development company, his charitable contributions, and his survivors, including his ex-wife Miranda, who was listed among the family members who would miss him. Miranda cried when she read the obituary, mourning not just Richard's death, but the relationship they might have had if they had both been wiser and more mature. She attended his funeral, sitting with David and other family members who welcomed her presence and shared memories of happier times. At the reception following the service, Vanessa approached Miranda with her new husband, a kind-looking man who clearly adored his wife. "I wanted to thank you again," Vanessa said, her voice steady but emotional, "for helping me during Richard's illness and for showing me that it was possible to start over after a marriage ended. I'm sorry it took a crisis for me to understand how badly I had behaved toward you." "We all did the best we could with what we knew at the time," Miranda replied, meaning it. "I'm glad you found happiness with Michael, and I'm grateful that Richard had time to make peace with his family before he died." The conversation was brief but genuine, marking a final resolution to the conflicts that had once seemed insurmountable. 5 years after leaving her old city, Miranda had built a real estate empire that spanned 3 states and included affordable housing projects that were changing communities for the better. She had also built a personal life that was rich and fulfilling, with close friendships, meaningful romantic relationships, and a sense of purpose that went far beyond financial success. The woman who had once been dismissed as just the first wife had become a nationally recognized advocate for innovative housing solutions and women's entrepreneurship. She spoke at conferences, mentored young businesswomen, and used her wealth to support causes she believed in. Her identity was entirely her own creation, built through choices and achievements rather than relationships or social status. Sometimes, when Miranda was featured in business publications or recognized for her philanthropic work, journalists would ask about her earlier life and the divorce that had motivated her business success. She would acknowledge that personal challenges had shaped her path, but she always emphasized that her achievements belonged to her alone. "I'm grateful for every experience that taught me something about myself," she would say when asked about overcoming adversity. "But I'm much more interested in talking about what we're building for the future than dwelling on what happened in the past." And that, Miranda realized, was the most complete victory of all. She had transformed from someone who was defined by other people's opinions and actions into someone who created her own definitions of success and happiness. The title of first wife had been replaced by dozens of more meaningful descriptions, but the most important one was simply this: a woman who had learned to value herself correctly and had built a life that reflected that value. Standing in her office in Portland, looking out at a city where she was known for her contributions rather than her scandals, Miranda smiled at the thought of how impossible her current life would have seemed to the woman who had once cried alone in a hospital room. Sometimes the worst betrayals really did lead to the best discoveries, and sometimes the most painful endings made room for the most beautiful beginnings. The woman who had called her just the first wife was now happily married to someone else. The man who had abandoned her during labor was at peace, and Miranda herself was exactly where she belonged: successful, independent, and finally, completely free. 10 years had passed since that fateful charity gala, and Miranda's life had evolved in ways she could never have imagined during those dark months following her divorce. Her real estate empire now spanned the entire Pacific Northwest, with groundbreaking developments that combined luxury living with affordable housing in innovative ways that were being studied and replicated across the country. The morning that would bring everything full circle started like any other. with Miranda reviewing architectural plans for her latest project, a mixed-income community that would provide housing for everyone from young professionals to senior citizens. Her assistant knocked and entered with an expression that suggested unexpected news. "Mrs. Ashford," she said, placing a thick envelope on Miranda's desk. "This arrived by special courier from New York. It's from the estate attorneys for someone named Vanessa Chen." Miranda's eyebrows rose in surprise as she recognized the name of Richard's second wife, who had remarried after their divorce and moved across the country with her cardiologist husband. Inside the envelope was a letter written in Vanessa's familiar handwriting, along with legal documents that made Miranda's breath catch. Vanessa had died unexpectedly in a car accident, and in a twist that no one could have predicted, she had left a substantial bequest to Miranda in her will. "I know this will come as a shock," Vanessa's letter began, "but I wanted you to have something that belonged to you long before it ever came to me. I've been carrying guilt for years about how I treated you, and about benefiting from Richard's cruelty during your divorce. This is my attempt to make amends, though I know it can never undo the pain I caused." The bequest wasn't money, it was something far more valuable and unexpected. Vanessa had inherited Richard's art collection after his death, including several pieces that Miranda had personally selected during their marriage but lost in the divorce settlement. There were also family heirlooms that had belonged to Richard's grandmother, pieces that Miranda had cherished but been forced to surrender when Richard claimed them as his separate property. But the most shocking item in the bequest was a sealed envelope that Vanessa's letter indicated contained something Richard had wanted Miranda to have, but had been too proud to give her while he was alive. Inside was a handwritten letter from Richard, dated just weeks before his death, along with financial documents that made Miranda's hands tremble as she read them. "My dearest Miranda," Richard's final letter began, "if you are reading this, then Vanessa has honored my request to ensure these documents reach you after my death. I discovered something during my recovery that I was too ashamed to tell you while I was alive, but which you deserve to know." The documents that followed revealed that Richard had hidden far more assets during their divorce than anyone had suspected. But more importantly, they showed that Richard had secretly established a trust fund in Miranda's name years before their marriage ended, recognizing that his business success had been built partly on her contributions and support. "You were right to be angry about the divorce settlement," Richard's letter continued. "I cheated you out of money that was rightfully yours, and I used legal technicalities to avoid acknowledging your role in building our wealth. This trust represents what I should have given you voluntarily, plus interest for all the years I withheld it. It won't undo the hurt I caused, but it might help you understand that I knew, even then, how much I owed you." The trust fund was worth several $1,000,000, money that had been growing untouched for over a decade, while Miranda built her own success independently. The irony was profound. Richard had secretly acknowledged her worth while publicly diminishing it, creating a financial legacy that would only be revealed after both he and his second wife were gone. Miranda sat in her office for a long time, reading and rereading the documents while processing the complex emotions they stirred up. The money would significantly expand her ability to fund affordable housing projects and other philanthropic endeavors, but it also represented a kind of vindication that she no longer needed for her own peace of mind. More than the financial value, the documents provided a glimpse into Richard's true thoughts during the final years of their marriage, and the guilt he had carried about his behavior. He had known he was being unfair and cruel, but had chosen to proceed anyway because he thought he could get away with it. The trust fund was his private acknowledgement of her worth, even as he publicly treated her as disposable. The discovery prompted Miranda to reflect on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had built her success independently, proving her worth through her own achievements rather than relying on money from her former marriage. The trust fund was unexpected validation, but it wasn't the source of her confidence or self-respect. Those had been earned through years of hard work and personal growth. Miranda decided to accept the bequest, but with a specific purpose in mind. The money would be used to establish a foundation focused on helping women rebuild their lives after divorce, providing not just financial support but also business mentoring and legal assistance. It would be called the Vanessa Chen Foundation for Women's Independence, honoring the woman who had once been her rival but had ultimately become an unexpected ally. The foundation's first project would be particularly meaningful to Miranda, a residential and business complex that would provide transitional housing for divorced women, while also offering office space for female entrepreneurs starting their own companies. It would be a place where women could rebuild their lives, surrounded by others who understood their challenges and supported their dreams. As news of the foundation spread through business and philanthropic circles, Miranda found herself fielding interview requests from journalists who wanted to understand the unusual story behind her latest venture. The idea of a successful businesswoman using money from her ex-husband's second wife to help other divorced women was too compelling for the media to ignore. "It's a story about forgiveness and growth," Miranda explained to a reporter from a national business magazine. "Vanessa and I started as adversaries, but we both learned that our real enemy was the system that pitted women against each other, instead of supporting everyone's right to dignity and independence. This foundation is our way of changing that narrative for other women." The interview was featured on the magazine's cover, with a photo of Miranda standing in front of the construction site for the foundation's first residential complex. The headline read, "From First Wife to First Lady of Real Estate, How One Woman Turned Betrayal into a Business Empire That's Changing Lives." But perhaps the most meaningful response to the foundation came from an unexpected source. Jake Williams, Richard's former colleague, who had been present during some of the most difficult moments of Miranda's divorce proceedings. Jake had followed Miranda's career over the years and reached out to offer support for the foundation's mission. "I watched how badly Richard treated you during the divorce," Jake wrote in his email, "and I've followed your success with admiration ever since. If you're looking for legal volunteers for the foundation, I'd like to help. Too many women go through divorce proceedings without adequate representation, and I'd like to be part of changing that." Jake's offer led to other professionals volunteering their services, creating a network of lawyers, accountants, therapists, and business consultants who were committed to helping divorced women navigate their transitions with dignity and support. The foundation became more than a housing project. It evolved into a comprehensive resource center that addressed the financial, legal, emotional, and practical challenges that women faced when rebuilding their lives. On the day of the foundation's official opening, Miranda stood before a crowd that included local officials, business leaders, and the first group of women who would live and work in the complex. Among the attendees was David Blackwell, Richard's brother, who had traveled from Chicago to show his support for the project. "Richard would have been proud of what you've built," David told Miranda during the reception. "He made terrible mistakes, but he always respected your intelligence and determination. I think he would have been amazed to see how you've turned his worst behavior into something that helps other people." Miranda smiled at the comment, appreciating David's attempt to find meaning in his brother's legacy. "I hope the foundation helps women understand that their worth isn't determined by how they're treated during a divorce," she replied. "Every woman deserves to rebuild her life with dignity and support, regardless of what happened in her marriage." The first residents of the Vanessa Chen Foundation complex were a diverse group of women ranging in age from their 20s to their 60s, each with their own story of marriage, divorce, and the courage to start over. There was Sarah, a teacher whose husband had hidden assets and left her struggling to support 2 children. Maria, a former stay-at-home mom who was starting a catering business after a 30-year marriage ended. Jennifer, a young woman who had escaped an abusive relationship and was working to complete her college degree. Miranda made a point of getting to know each resident personally, sharing meals in the complex's community dining room, and offering informal mentoring sessions for women starting their own businesses. She found these interactions more rewarding than any of her previous business achievements, knowing that her success was directly contributing to other women's opportunities for independence and self-determination. One evening, as Miranda was leaving the foundation complex after a business planning workshop, she encountered a woman sitting alone in the courtyard garden, looking lost and overwhelmed. The woman introduced herself as Rebecca, a new resident who had just moved in after finalizing a difficult divorce from a prominent surgeon who had convinced her she was worthless and incapable of surviving on her own. "I keep wondering if I made a mistake," Rebecca confided, tears streaming down her face. "My ex-husband keeps calling to tell me I'll never make it on my own, that I'll come crawling back to him within 6 months. What if he's right? What if I'm not strong enough for this?" Miranda sat down beside Rebecca, remembering her own moments of doubt and despair during the darkest days of her divorce. "Can I tell you something?" she said gently. 15 years ago, I was sitting in a hospital room holding my newborn daughter, feeling completely abandoned and convinced that my life was over. The man I'd trusted with everything had not only left me during labor, but had spent months planning to take everything we'd built together. Rebecca looked up with surprise, clearly not expecting such a personal revelation. Miranda continued, I felt exactly like you feel right now, scared, angry, and convinced that I wasn't strong enough to rebuild my life. But here's what I learned. The people who try to convince you that you're weak and helpless are usually the ones who have the most to lose if you discover your own strength. Over the following hour, Miranda shared more of her story. Not just the business success, but the emotional journey of learning to value herself correctly and the daily choices that had gradually built her confidence and independence. She talked about the setbacks and moments of doubt, but also about the incredible satisfaction of building something entirely her own. The foundation exists because women like us are stronger than we realize, Miranda concluded. Every woman who rebuilds her life after divorce is proving that independence and happiness are possible, even when it feels impossible. You're not just surviving, you're showing other women what's possible. 6 months later, Rebecca had launched a successful consulting business helping medical practices improve their patient communication systems. She credited Miranda's mentorship and the supportive environment of the foundation complex with giving her the confidence to pursue her professional dreams. Stories like Rebecca's became common at the foundation, with women discovering talents and ambitions they had never been encouraged to develop during their marriages. The complex buzzed with entrepreneurial energy as residents collaborated on business ventures, shared resources and contacts, and celebrated each other's successes. The success of the Vanessa Chen Foundation led to requests from other cities to replicate the model, with Miranda consulting on similar projects across the country. Each new complex was adapted to local needs and conditions, but all shared the same core mission of providing women with the resources and support needed to rebuild their lives with dignity and independence. As Miranda's 50th birthday approached, she found herself reflecting on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this point in her life. The woman who had been dismissed as just the first wife had become a nationally recognized advocate for women's economic empowerment, but more importantly, she had created a life that was entirely her own design. The birthday celebration was held at the original foundation complex, with residents past and present joining Miranda's friends, family, and colleagues for an evening of reflection and gratitude. The event raised money for expanding the foundation's services, but it also served as a testament to what was possible when women supported each other's dreams and aspirations. During her speech that evening, Miranda looked out at the crowd of women whose lives had intersected with hers through the foundation and felt overwhelmed by the connections and community that had grown from her personal crisis years earlier. When I was going through my divorce, she said, I thought my story was about one woman's betrayal and another woman's revenge. But I understand now that it was really about discovering that our worth isn't determined by how others treat us, but by how we choose to treat ourselves and each other. She paused, looking around the room at faces that represented different stages of the journey from dependence to independence. Every woman who has lived here, worked here, or been supported by this foundation has contributed to changing the narrative about what's possible after divorce. You've shown that endings can become beginnings, that betrayal can become empowerment, and that the worst moments of our lives can become the foundation for our greatest achievements. The applause that followed was sustained and emotional, but Miranda was most moved by the sight of women embracing each other and wiping away tears. The foundation had become more than a housing complex or business incubator. It was a community of women who understood that their individual success was connected to everyone else's opportunities. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and guests began to leave, Miranda walked through the complex's gardens, thinking about the path that had led her here. The charity gala, where Vanessa had dismissed her as just the first wife, seemed like a lifetime ago, but it had been the catalyst for everything that followed. She thought about Richard, whose cruelty had ultimately led to her discovering her own strength. About Vanessa, whose final act of generosity had enabled the foundation's creation. About all the women who had found new lives and possibilities within these walls. About the community that had grown from individual pain into collective empowerment. Standing in the courtyard where she had first met Rebecca, Miranda smiled at the realization that her story had come full circle in the most beautiful way possible. She was no longer just the first wife or even the successful businesswoman. She was simply Miranda, a woman who had learned to value herself correctly and had used that knowledge to help others do the same. The title that mattered most now wasn't one that anyone else could give or take away. She was a woman who had transformed betrayal into purpose, isolation into community, and personal pain into collective healing. And that was a legacy worth building a life around. As she walked back toward her car, Miranda passed the foundation's main building, where lights still glowed in several windows. Women working late on business plans, studying for degrees, or simply talking with neighbors who understood their journey. Tomorrow would bring new residents, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that women's worth wasn't determined by their relationship status, but by their courage to rebuild and their commitment to supporting each other's dreams. The woman who had once been dismissed as insignificant had created something that would outlast any marriage, any business deal, any personal slight. She had built a place where women could discover their own worth and use it to transform not just their own lives, but the lives of every woman who came after them. And in the end, that was the most complete victory of all. 5 years later, Miranda stood at the podium of the National Women's Economic Empowerment Conference, preparing to deliver the keynote address to over 3,000 attendees. At 55, she had become one of the most recognizable advocates for women's financial independence in the country, but tonight felt different. Tonight would be her final public speech, before stepping back from the spotlight to focus on the next chapter of her life. The Vanessa Chen Foundation had grown to include 12 locations across 8 states, housing and supporting over 2,000 women in their transitions to independence. The model had been studied by universities, replicated internationally, and had influenced policy changes that made divorce proceedings more equitable for economically vulnerable spouses. But beyond the statistics and accolades, Miranda was most proud of the individual stories. Women like Rebecca, who now ran a multi-million-dollar consulting firm, or Maria, whose catering business had grown into a restaurant empire that employed over 200 people. As she looked out at the audience, Miranda could see faces that represented every stage of the journey she had taken herself. Women in the depths of crisis, others in the middle of rebuilding, and many who had found success and were now helping others navigate the same path. The diversity of ages, backgrounds, and circumstances reminded her that the experience of being undervalued and dismissed was unfortunately universal, but so was the capacity for resilience and reinvention. 15 years ago, Miranda began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. I was a woman who had lost everything: my marriage, my financial security, and most importantly, my sense of worth. I had been so defined by my relationship to another person that when that relationship ended, I felt like I disappeared along with it. She paused, allowing the weight of that admission to settle over the audience. I spent months believing that my ex-husband and his new wife were right about me, that I was just the first wife, a placeholder who could be easily replaced and forgotten. But the most important lesson I learned wasn't about business or real estate or even revenge. It was about the difference between being valued by others and valuing yourself. Miranda went on to share highlights from her journey: the late nights learning about property investment, the terror and exhilaration of making her first major business decision, the gradual realization that her worth had never been dependent on anyone else's recognition. But she also talked about the mistakes she had made, the energy she had wasted on anger, and the ultimately hollow victory of proving her critics wrong. I want to tell you about forgiveness, she said, her voice growing softer but more intense. Not the kind of forgiveness that excuses bad behavior or asks you to forget how you were hurt, but the kind of forgiveness that frees you from carrying other people's failures as if they were your own. When I finally let go of my need to punish the people who had hurt me, I discovered I had so much more energy to invest in building something beautiful. The speech concluded with Miranda announcing that she was transitioning leadership of the foundation to the women it had served. A board of directors composed entirely of former residents who had built successful businesses and wanted to ensure that future generations of women would have the same opportunities they had received. The greatest measure of success isn't what you achieve for yourself, Miranda said in closing, but what you make possible for others. Every woman who leaves an unhappy marriage, starts a business, goes back to school, or simply decides she deserves better treatment, is changing the world for every woman who comes after her. Your courage to rebuild your life gives someone else permission to rebuild theirs. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes, but Miranda was most moved by the sight of women throughout the audience embracing each other, sharing tears and encouragement. This was what she had hoped to create. Not just individual success stories, but a community of women who understood that their fates were interconnected. As she stepped away from the podium for the final time, Miranda knew that the woman who had once been dismissed as just the first wife had become something far more powerful. The architect of countless new beginnings. Her story was complete, but theirs were just beginning. The end.